So I'm delighted to be hosting this talk today as part of Cardiff Uni's fantastic programme really of events to celebrate Black History Month. So I'm only going to do the very boring bits, the housekeeping bits. So we're not expecting the fire alarm to go off today. So if we do hear the fire alarm, please follow a member of staff. So if staff can just raise their hands to follow us. No food and drink are permitted here because we do have some items from the collections out. So if you do have anything on you, please just stow them away, which is fine, and I'll turn the blind light. Right then, there's no toilet on this floor, so if you need to pop to the toilet, they're upstairs. Is that it? Housekeeping? Yes. Right then, am I into Julie or Sarah? Sarah first then. So this is Sarah Hughes, who's a very new recruit to Special Collections. Hello. And she's our new Civic Engagement Officer, and she's laid out some items from the collections here, so she's going to just say a little bit about...
Yeah, just to extend an invitation if you wanted to have a look at the display after the talk, you'd be very welcome to. And we'll also be showing a film from the National Library of Wales archives about Boot Town specifically. This is the first time I've approached this archive through the lens of Black history, and it showed me kind of how incomplete that story is that we can tell, but also how valuable the items that we do have here are in showing how Black people in Cardiff have been viewed by white readers over time, what their concerns were, and how they were displayed. Black people's voices, their opinions, their worldviews are underrepresented. And so I have also put out some feedback cards, so if there are ways that you would like to respond to the collections, whether it's a creative response, an academic response, I'd really love for that conversation to keep going. And if anybody here is interested in maintaining that conversation in the longer term, it's an open invitation to you to interact with us and to get to know us a little better and tell us what you want to see us doing. Thanks very much.
This is Julie.
Hello everyone. Thank you for coming to the talk today. We've had various events during Black History Month, so I'm really, really pleased today that Abu-Bakr Madden Al-Shabazz can come and do this amazing talk. I first heard about Abu-Bakr when I was doing an induction talk at the university, and I had people coming up, new members of staff coming up to me and asking about equality, diversity and inclusion. And one of the main areas that we're trying to do here is really to kind of educate people on the history of Cardiff as part of that. And somebody that came up to me actually talked to me and said to me, you need to get this guy in, he's amazing. He's really passionate and really engaging, no pressure. So I am really pleased that we managed to track him down. We had a bizarre kind of introduction in that I was trying to track you down and you appeared at the Lifelong Centre for Learning, where Abu has done lots and lots of teaching in the past. I mean, he's very kind of specialised in this area. He does lots of work around this area. He's been on TV, on radio, and there's some DVDs at the back as well. He's been involved in a project called Wales Untold, about the industrial history of Cardiff, including Black history, and various other roles, including I was having a conversation with him today. Not only does he do all that, but he works with, he does parenting skills and works with children with challenging and teenagers with challenging behaviour. So multi-talented, and it's really nice that you can make it today, so thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks everybody for turning up. I really appreciate it. Welcome to this Black History Month event. And I'd like to thank everyone who's turned up, who's invited me, who's encouraged me, who's spoken highly of me. I just hope I can pull it off today. Right, first things first. Right, Wales Untold. Now, I'm selling DVDs called Wales Untold as part of a Black History project which took place about 2 years ago. There was a National Lottery Heritage Fund given to a group in Newport called Urban Circle. And Urban Circle decided they wanted to do something on what's known as positive identity. So what they decided to do, they wanted to work with kids, but they didn't know how far they would go with it. I read about the amount of funds which was given to them. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a sore throat, so do excuse me, please. So when I contacted them, because I read about they were given approximately £40,000. So I contacted them and said, look, if I can come on as a consultant, I specialise in Black and African history, I specialise in identity, etc., and I'm sure I can contribute to this. So what took place later on was they decided to get a professional cameraman down to film, and they focused on the history, the local history of Cardiff and Newport. And they want to look at the ethnic diversity within Wales. Because what's coming to light now is that a lot of archaeological evidence are discovering and finding ancient African skulls and African remains up and down Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and even England. So the presence of black people in this country is for thousands of years. It's just not recent. And I'm going to try to go through some of those stages, try to explain certain things, what books and references we can get these things from. And this is the whole point of Black History Month, because as you, unfortunately, with the slavery period, the colonial period, you know people from Africa who are of African descent. What took place eventually was that they were subjugated by the European and the colonial powers. So as far as upward mobility was concerned in the global world or the global market, it was actually downward for them. Okay? And a lot of colonizers at that particular time, especially colonial administrators going into Africa, rewriting African history, putting Africa in the anthropological studies as being savage and primitive, etc. So the whole point of Black History Month is for us to reclaim back our history and put those torn and ripped pages back in place. This is the whole point of this. It's not to exclude people, it's to bring people into our narrative, into our story. Because for the last 500 years, our narrative and story has been told by other people. Right, one of the important things I'd like to say about this project was the young kids, they were between the ages of 10 and 17, there was approximately between 8 and 12, because a couple of them dropped out. And what happened, they went to Newport University, they learned how to do qualitative and quantitative data. They wanted to know what type of questions they were going to ask. So they got a lot of academics from different types of backgrounds to look at the multicultural history of Cardiff. Okay, so like I said, if anybody wants to purchase this, okay, it's £5. There's 3 different DVDs on it. There's a making of the DVD with the young kids, with Urban Circle. There's the main documentary with all the academics and residents of Newport and Cardiff. And there's also a time walk through Tiger Bay. So there's 3 different segments of videos on here. Right, introduction. Now, a couple of things I'm going to pass over today. I've got loads of slides, so I'm going to just run through them because I know some of you are here for a short time, for lunch, etc. So I'll try and get through as much as I can. So we're going to look at the prehistoric Britain and Wales, colonisation and industrialisation in Wales, and we're going to look at migrant workers in the Commonwealth and how all this links together. Now, when Black history is being taught in this country, according to Orlando Patterson, it usually takes 3 states or stages or methods in communicating that element, that historical element, to people. So, for instance, there's a catastrophic, contributionism, and a survivalist. So usually when Black history is taught, it's usually taught under the catastrophic or the survivalist mode. Either the way we were oppressed or we lost our land, or the way we were enslaved and exploited. Okay? That's the main streams of Black history, how it's being taught in the West. Now, for Black people, what's taking place since the 1960s with the Black study programs coming up was that African Americans, African Caribbeans, who were going into the university system decided they wanted and they needed to change things. And the contribution aspect was what was really important with that. So it was reconnecting back to ancient Kush, ancient Egypt, ancient Nubia, Mali, Songhai, Ghana, all those African empires, all of those empires in Africa. This is what it was all about. And to prove and to show that the people who built high civilizations, especially if you look at ancient Egypt, were African people. And like a lot of DNA evidence is proving this now. You know, Asiatics were much later on in the stage, especially the Greco-Roman period. This is when ancient Egypt was falling. And you had things with Nubia and Kush trying to take over, but they couldn't sustain themselves. And then the Asiatic powers literally took over. Right, the first thing which I'm going to mention, in the 1980s, there was this article, The Search for Adam and Eve. Now, Rebecca Cann who was from the University of Hawaii. She decided to conduct a study on mitochondrial DNA, where 147 women were samples, their placentas were used to extract DNA. What she found from this study in the late 1980s, that every single woman of this 147 who came from different racial groups, ethnic groups, clans, tribes, etc., all descended from one woman, which can be dated back in East Africa approximately 90,000 to 150,000 years ago. Okay? So this is what took place, and the large elements of mutations of mitochondrial DNA is looking at the female line, how mother passes the genetic material onto her daughter and so forth. So if a woman, for instance, has a son, that particular DNA from mitochondria is passed to the son, but he can't pass it on. So it's from a female to female line. So this was a monumental finding in the late 1980s. Right, here you can see the different forms of genetic markers. Okay, so if you look at Africa, for instance, L1, L2, L3. So the oldest group on the planet is basically the Khoisan people. These are the people who Nelson Mandela is descended from. Okay, they're Oriental-looking Africans. Okay, they got the epicantic fold. Okay, and these are people. They have yellowish skin to dark brown skin. And you can see if you look at Nelson Mandela, a lot of the Khoisan people, they got that epicantic fault, okay? And they say that the Asiatics inherited that dominant trait from the Khoisan. They found Khoisan bones, which dates back to 40 to 50,000 years in places like Bulgaria, Russia, in places like the Americas as well, which is more of a later period. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that these Africans, these Khoisan people, didn't just move down from East Africa to Southern Africa, where you find L1. They actually ventured out of Africa and populated the rest of the world. And this is how this came about. And through climatic changes that took place on the globe or on the Earth, different types of mutation emerged, where people started to either increase or to lose their pigmentation. So the emphasis here with this main study that Rebecca Khan did, she was trying to prove that there's no such thing as a race. There's only one race, that's the human race. And that is what genetics and DNA is telling us and teaching us. Right, this is a description of a Grimaldi. Now, Grimaldi skeletons have been found, like I said, all over the place. Now, what the hypothesis is, and it's probably pretty clear that this is what happened. Approximately 50 to 50,000 years ago, Africans left, went into places like Arabia, went into Europe, Asia, and obviously they beachcombed into Australia. So this took place around about 70,000 years ago, approximately. We start to see migrations taking place outside of Africa, and people starting to move into different areas. Okay, some of them maintain particular phenotypes. So there was a thing which was known as the Wilmington Stagio. This was the last ice stage. So around about 50,000 years ago, there was black-skinned Africans in Asia, up in the north. The Wilmington Stagio was the ice age, which lasted between 50 to 20,000 years. During this particular period, Africans went through a depigmentation process where they started to lose their skin color. The nose started to become slightly narrower. Okay, the hair started to become more straight. And according to some geneticists, they believe that this change was to adapt to the climatic environment that they now found themselves in. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize here, that even though most of the Africans went through that depigmented stage, they didn't all die out. They did not all die. There were still large amounts of Africans which were living approximately 40,000 years ago. So Grimaldis are prehistoric Africans, Cro-Magnon are the prehistoric Europeans. Now, one of the things when you look at these studies, etc., is that when they talk about Cro-Magnon being ancient, they're only round about 20 to 30,000 years old. Okay, so they're a much later mutation, the Cro-Magnon. And it's clear that they are descendants from the Grimaldis. And it's during that period, if you read the works by Nina Jablonski, who's a geneticist, she even says that it took 50 to 20,000 years for that depigmentation to take place. Okay? Molecular biology in the 1980s said exactly the same thing. So you've got two separate sciences giving us the exact dates during that particular period. So when I want to emphasize that when Cro-Magnon is used, it's used sometimes in a period when there was no Asiatics or Europeans. Okay, so it gives the impression that the Europeans are much older and the indigenous people, they came much later. If you're looking at depigmentation, straight hair, straight nose, they have a later mutation that came about. Okay, like I said, African bones have been found in the British Isles, and they've been found everywhere. And there's been loads of discoveries of African bones in Wales, especially in South Wales. A lot of this information has been suppressed, and there's for obvious reasons why. Because they do not want, because the question is now, the white Welsh or the white Celts who live here, the Irish, the Scottish, the English and the Welsh, where do they originally come from? Because it was a people, a much darker people who preceded them to this island. If you read a book by David McRitchie, Ancient and Modern Britons, an excellent book, a book that took me 15 years to get. This talks about the history of Britain when it was black for thousands and thousands of years. And remnants of their remains, linguistic expressions, totemism, cultural elements are still found within the people of Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and England as well. So for instance, in this particular book here, now this book is being suppressed. This book was written around about the 1880s, and it really looks at the history of Britain before we get to the white Celts. Okay, they're a much later migratory force that came into the UK or came into the British Isles. Okay, but there was no contention between the two groups. This concept of discrimination or racism only really emerged in the 1700s. So it's a recent thing, but people never had a problem in antiquity as far as skin colour was concerned. Now, other evidences to show that there was dark-skinned people here is that if you look at David McRitchie was a linguist, and what he started noticing when he looked at the linguist, that these people with the name Brown, Black, Douglas basically means the black stranger, and Duff. This all indicated dark-skinned people. And then what happened, when those Celtic people came in, people started to get lighter. So in order to attribute themselves to this great civilization or great cultural group that died in the UK or died in the British Isles, they would identify with these names. And later names to actually show that they were dark-skinned people here, and we'll look at some of the etymological evidences to substantiate this, is like the word Moore, Morris, Morgan, Blackamoor. Anyone who has these names are definitely from the indigenous people from this land, unless they adopted these names much later. They may have been adopted, they may have been added with these names, but those people who can trace their genealogy or genealogy back, they can actually date them back to these dark-skinned Celtic people that lived in the British Isles, especially Scotland and Wales, because there's no England. England was something which was created much later, when the Angles and the Saxons came here. Right, pre-Romans, blacks, to the contemporary. Right, Stay in Power is a book written by Peter Fryer. It's an excellent book, about 400 or 500 pages. This is what he says. There were Africans in Britain before the English came here. There were soldiers in the Roman Imperial Army that occupied the southern part of our island for 3.5 centuries. Among the troops defending Hadrian's Wall in the 3rd century AD was a division of Moors. Okay, division of Moors, these are dark-skinned people. This is what the word Moor means. Etymologically, it means a dark-skinned person. Okay, when these names were being used, like brown, black, they were not pejorative or negative names. They were adjectives just describing something. And there were hundreds of coats of arms and cresses of African heads in this country on certain families. You will see this if you go to Sardinia, for instance. You would see Moorish heads on the flag So the African presence, even though it may have died out as far as the power is concerned, what they were able to do, they were able to have remnants of these things within a linguistic expression or with people's oral tradition. This is what came out of this reality. Now, one thing I want to emphasize about this quotation is that when Romans came here, they said there was already black people here. And then they brought the North African, because we know in 146 BC, the Romans took over North Africa. So, and when they took over North Africa, that became their military power. There was a lot of corn and grain, etc., which was going into the Roman Empire. And when they were extending and expanding their territories more to the west, it was a North African soldiers, mainly from Libya, that was stationed in the 2nd to 3rd century AD in the UK. Now, Gerald Massey and Godfrey Higgins are two white anthropologist scholars of the 19th century. Now, according to Gerald Massey, he says that Mauryan, Mauryan, a Cushite, was the one who was responsible for building Stonehenge. Now, this is what he says. And this is supposed to have been reflected in the oral traditions of the Welsh and the English people. Now, the reason why I mention this and what connections I have in Wales is that many of the archaeologists which look at this say that the stones themselves came from Wales before they went to this particular region where they built this. And Godfrey Higgins talks about Negro Buddhists. These are Dravidian, black Dravidians, because it was different groups of people. A lot of the archaeological evidence which has been discovered in the British Isles have shown they were Australian type looking dark-skinned people. That was one group. There was another group known as the Twa, which is the Pygmies, what they're from the Congo. They're short, diminutive individuals. They're another group of people that were living in this country. And then you've got the sub-Saharan type that were here. So over that 30 to 40,000 year wave, there's been different type of African groups migrating and settling here. And then many of them which actually came from places like Spain and settled in places like Ireland. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that black people in antiquity lived all over the planet, okay, along with different ethnic groups. So the question here is, with the first Britons Negroes, there is considerable evidence that there might have been Grimaldi relics that have been dug up in England. So England, Wales, Scotland, they're finding loads, but this information is being suppressed, deliberately being suppressed, because it stops the people who feel they're native or indigenous to this country of asking themselves, where do we originally come from? The light of the more light of Europe's dark ages. Although the term Moor has been put to diverse use in root, its roots are still traceable, which I talked about earlier. Around 46 BC, the Roman army entered West Africa, where they encountered black Africans, whom they called Moorish, from the Greek adjective moros, meaning dark or black. So when you look at the Moorish period that took place in Spain, you're talking about the 800-year period. Even though the word Moor now is being put on Muslims, who are Arabs and Africans, that controlled North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. The thing is what I want to emphasize here is that the word Moor was used at least 700 years before the period of Islam. So we're talking about people here. Okay, it's not a religious group. It was people who became religious much later on, but people from West Africa, Northwest Africa, were considered Moors. Right. There's considerable difficulty, however, in determining the ethnicity of the early Moors through terminology alone. Indeed, there are several terms that have been used to identify the Moors. Arabic texts, for example, rarely use the word Moor and instead apply the term Berber. So this is another element now where you have North African Berbers who were actually coming to the British Isles for thousands of years, before and after the Islamic period. We have certain stories of what they refer to as the Moorish dances, for instance. If you go to many of the places in England, there are people who darken up their faces, dressed with like turbans, etc. They said that they are copying and following their ancestors who came from Spain and who actually settled here. We know even as far as the 1500s that Queen Elizabeth I herself, because she was talking about the problems that was taking place in England, of the amount of dark-skinned people that were living here. So there was an expulsion, there was an edict to expel these dark-skinned people in the 1500s. But at the same time they were being expelled, she was allowing the slave trade to come in at the same time. So people who had an element of power were being pushed out to bring more subordinate people. And that's really where the history of black people really begins in most of the literature in this country. Right, Dana Reynolds, she talks about the mortuary related to the Berbers. Okay, she worked with Zawi Hawass, the Egyptologist from Egypt. She did, I think it was a 2-year semester she did with him, you know, looking at artifacts, etc. She's an anthropologist. And she's written about the North African Berbers, and she's done an extensive research. And what was shocking for her, what she didn't realise, because usually when you look at the Berbers, they're usually blonde hair, blue eyes. These are the Germanic groups that went in around about the 3rd to the 4th century. You know, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals. They're descended from those people, later invaders that came in, and they took on this Berber culture. Berber culture is an African culture, and Berber is an African language. Okay? So when you do look at Berbers, for instance, you'll see different types. You've got black Berbers, white Berbers, yellow, brown, etc. Okay? But what she was surprised with her research, that every time she looked at every single Berber tribe, she traced it back, they were dealing with a dark-skinned people. Okay, dark-skinned people. So you had Germanic people moving into North Africa, yeah, and they were amalgamating and mixing. Colour conflict did not exist, like I said. It didn't really come along until the 1700s. Okay, and this is just to establish it again. Okay, in Ireland, in connection with ancient West African mariners, it's also interesting to note that according to Irish historical legends, the Celtic island was invaded and dominated for a time by sea rovers from northwest Africa called the Fomorians. And obviously you've got the word Moor in there again. And in County Cork in Ireland, that was actually a predominantly Muslim settlement round about the 10th, 11th century. Okay, this is only coming to light now. We had Muslim settlers in Ireland living as Muslims, etc. They were dark-skinned people from North and West Africa. And this is coming from the Irish tradition. This is one crest of an aristocratic woman. Obviously, you can see it's a dark-skinned woman of a family crest from Scotland. So if you read, what's his name now, David Ritchie's book, these are sort of images and figures that he's talking about, the pictorial evidences, okay, to substantiate to prove what he is talking about. So I talked about Queen Victoria throwing out the Moors, okay. So history's going to change now, okay. History's going to begin to change. Now in 1518, there was a thing that Elizabeth I talked about, was the principles of effective occupation. So this is whereby, because the Moors were kicked out of Spain in 1492. The Africans, the Arabs, and forced out, kicked out in 1492. Then we see the likes of Columbus go in, so-called discovering the so-called New World. Columbus himself never set foot on North or South America. It was in the Caribbean islands, but yet we're taught that he's discovered the Americas. I've read his diaries, etc. He never stepped foot on North or South America. It was peripheral elements that Columbus went into, like Jamaica, the Bahamas, Barbados, Trinidad. They're the places that he went. He didn't go to those main places. So in 1492, when the Moors were kicked out of Spain, a lot of them were dispersed. The first people were taken to the Caribbean islands were Moors, who later became Maroons, the Maroon tribes. These were Muslims who were fighting the Spanish and tried to hold on to their identity. They actually went to the Caribbean islands, settled, moved to the mountains, and they were resisting British or Spanish rule. So the word Moor now becomes Maroons. Maroons comes from a Spanish word, semarone, if I'm saying it right, which means wild or untamed. Okay? It's an adjective, a negative adjective which is being used. So the principles of effective occupation was basically when she was sending pirates and buccaneers out, was if you can occupy land, because what happened 2 years after 1492, 1494, what happened was the Pope split the world into two. He gave half the world to Portugal, half the world to Spain. This is why Brazil is Portuguese speaking, because the way you cut the equatorial line, that Brazil was in the Portuguese side, and Portugal was given Brazil, Africa, and Asia. Okay, this is why if you go to a place like India and Pakistan, you have individuals from these communities who got Portuguese surnames. Okay, they occupied that land long before the Dutch and the English went in there. And the Caribbean islands, Canada, the Caribbean islands, North America, South America, Central America was given to the Spanish. Britain, Holland, and all these countries were against the Treaty of Tordesillas. This is what it was called. They were against it because the Catholic crowns had monopoly not just over the oceans, but over land resources. So this was at this particular period, Queen Elizabeth is basically saying, well, look, we don't really want to upset the Spanish and the Portuguese territories. So the principle of effective occupation is if you can go in to those particular areas that are occupied by the Spanish and Portuguese and keep those lands without raising conflict, then you can stay there. Okay, this was an edict. This is what she was basically saying. And this is how England started to grow economically from this particular period. We started to see many commodities come into this country, such as sugar, cotton, different types of fabrics. Okay, spices started to come into this country. So this is what really begins to build what would later become the Industrial Revolution. Let's have a look at the connection to Wales. Now, in Swansea, I can't remember the name of the place, but in Swansea, where, especially in the 1800s, in most of the 1800s anyway, this is where there was a copper plant. Okay, a lot of this copper was going to assist people in the so-called Americas. A lot of the copper that was being made in Swansea during the Industrial Revolution was either for tools or punishment instruments for people in the Caribbean islands. And Merthyr, or the Cathartha Ironworks, was responsible for creating these chains that they would put slaves in. So what you will actually see now that Wales is participating in the slave trade along with England and Scotland, as well as Ireland to a small extent. So this is the contribution that is actually coming out of Wales. You can see that the labour that is coming out of the Caribbean islands now is slowly building Wales. One of the main families was the Morgan family. Henry Morgan, I've got some slides and I'm going to show him later. But he was Welsh. He controlled Cardiff Newport Road. Okay, that was his territories. Okay, a lot of the money which was spent in Newport Road today actually comes out of Barbados, Trinidad, and Jamaica. They were the three main contributors to what built Newport Road. This is a historical fact, but this is only slowly coming to light now. So that's what Henry Morgan was able to do, was able to produce. Well, he was a philanthropist to a large extent. And then slowly what the Morgan family started doing was giving a lot of this territory, or this land, to other people. Right, Welsh American pioneers, Thomas Jefferson and Jefferson Davis, Welsh descendants. A lot of people don't know that. Can I drink here or?
It's just your mouth seems to get a bit dry.
It is my throat. Okay, so this is what you have here. So what I'm trying to emphasize here, you got about Welsh people who were settling in the Americas. But the first place of settlement was the Caribbean islands before they went to North America. The Caribbean islands were much smaller, it was easy to confine, easy to control. And this is where a lot of Welsh people went. And then later on, especially after 1776, etc., we see a large expansion of Welsh people going to those places. And when new prison colonies opened up, especially in the 1700s, such as New Zealand and Australia, these were other places for colonies. Because in this country, there was a feudal system for about 1,000 years. Okay, so, and a lot of the people from Wales that went to the Caribbean islands were indentured slaves. They would sell their labour maybe for 7, 14 years, 5 years, whatever the case may be. And then obviously they would pay back what they did, because when they were forced onto ships or went onto ships, they didn't have no money, so they had to work it off in order to pay off their so-called debt, especially the food and the tools. This is what a lot of the Welsh people had gone through when they went to the Americas. Okay? A lot of them were a criminal class, were prisoners. A lot of them were snatched from the streets, put into different ports, and shipped over to these countries. So here, a thing of Henry Morgan. And if you've noticed over recent years, they slowly put in a lot of advertisements of Henry Morgan on the television. Now, Henry Morgan was a pirate. Even though he was the governor of Jamaica in the 1600s, he was a pirate. And the way that he ran Jamaica, for instance, was devastating. Prostitution was high amongst dark-skinned women. Pregnancy was really, really high. Okay? Henry Morgan was known for raiding off coastal regions, especially in places like Central America. Okay? But he's considered a hero. And these are some of the conflicts we have with Black History Month. Who can be a hero and who's not a hero? Or who's a shero, who's not a shero? Okay? Because the amount of atrocities and murders and killings that he did is rarely spoken about. Okay? So Henry Morgan was born in Llanrumney, Newport. He was a pirate, usually referred to as a buccaneer. He was knighted in 1675 by Charles II. This was after the Restoration period, because we know that Oliver Cromwell had assassinated Charles I's father. Okay? So this is where Britain gets back into the element of the slave trade now, at this particular period. Okay, and he became the governor of Jamaica. Now this is Llanrumney. Now I've done research on this, and a lot of people say that it was slave money which was used to build, especially from Jamaica. Okay? But it looks like the foundation of the building was there before even Henry Morgan was even born. Okay? But so there's a difference in opinion amongst local Welsh scholars whether the money that came out of Jamaica especially is what built this, or whether it was something that was built prior to them, the Morgan family, engaged in slavery, and obviously they were able to build upon those foundations. And this is one of the things which was produced, Captain Morgan's rum. Now, one of my things as a historian, which I believe, is that the word rum actually comes from Rumney and Llanrumney. Because what was really common at that time, when a lot of Welsh people, as well as the English and the Irish, when they were going over to settle in the Americas at that particular time, they would bring elements of their home with them. So if you look at Jamaica, for instance, we have places like Surrey, we have places like London, yeah? So places that come from here, we've got places like Devon, this is in Jamaica. And if you go to Sierra Leone, you will have similar things. So what happens when people go to other people's countries and settle there, etc., they bring a bit of their home with them, okay? In a naming ceremony sort of thing. And then rum was also produced in Newport, Rhode Island. So this is evidence that Newport docks is having some sort of sway, some sort of influence on trade this particular period. Not so much Cardiff, but it's mainly Newport at this particular time. Okay? And this is the connection that Henry Morgan has with Wales, with what takes place in the so-called colony, especially the Caribbean islands. Okay? Look at black labour. I'm not going to deal with the slavery period, etc. I want to look at the later part of black labour, because our relationship with Welsh people really begins around about as early as 1627. Okay, during the time of Oliver Cromwell. It was Oliver Cromwell who actually, after the English Civil War, it was Oliver Cromwell who later on took the islands of Jamaica, St. Kitts, Antigua off the Spanish. Okay? And he was able then to use the wealth that was being produced from there to pay back his loans for the Civil War, or the English Civil War. So, black labour can be divided into so many things. We can look at black labour during the time of slavery, we can look at black labour during the First World War, the Second World War, but black people and Welsh people, black people and British people have participated with one another for thousands and thousands of years. Okay? This is nothing new. It's not just, it's pre-slavery and post-slavery. There's a connection between the two groups. So let me just run through some of these. The West Indian or West African troops arrived in Britain in 1950. Okay, at the Battle of the Somme, okay, the West Indian troops, the West Indian regiments are on the front line in 1960. Okay, so even though they talk about the Somme and the Somme War, you never hear about the African and the West Indian regiment troops dying. And what they had to do, carrying bombs and shells and German bombardment. Who dug the trenches? It was these people who dug the trenches. No one really thinks about who actually dug the trenches. Who was doing this and who was washing the clothes for the soldiers, cleaning their boots. This is what they were there for. So even though they were giving guns and they were posing, they didn't really fight. And when they were losing thousands of white people on the battlefield, that's when the West Indian and the West African Regiment was now being used. British West Indian Regiment, July the 17th. Okay, there's an example of them. This is dangerous work, carrying shells from one place to another. Sometimes those shells would explode. And you also have black females who were involved with the war effort as well. And many of them came and settled in places like England and Wales. If you look at the American Revolutionary War in 1776, there was a lot of Caribbeans that participated with the British, and there was black people from Canada to try to rule out any control coming from the Republic, which it would be later known. So the thing what I'm trying to emphasize here is the importance of looking at that type of relationship. Yeah. So the West Indian and the West African troops arrived in 1950. So there was a community here. There was a large amount of black people living here, approximately 20,000 before the 1900s. Most of them had died out, not through death, etc., by marrying local white females, and they became much lighter. So there's always been a different wave of people coming over here. Even from Asia, there was people coming here. Even from Eastern Europe, Western Europe. So migration has always taken place. Migration is nothing new for the British Isles. We're all descent of migrants in one way or another. So in 1919, let's have a look at Wales. This is what takes place. The first race riot in history that takes place as a race riot is in 1919. The soldiers returned back to Wales. Okay? White soldiers, black soldiers returned back to Wales. What happens? Most of the soldiers who were marching, they saw either their old girlfriends or prostitutes, because many of the men that went from Wales to fight in the war, yeah, they were pimps. They saw a lot of these black men. Now, the largest group of dark-skinned people that lived in the turn of the century were West Africans. They were the largest group, okay, that lived in Wales. So the first race riot takes place in 1919 in June, where there's a dispute between a black male and a white female. It seems like they were in a relationship. And there was a soldier that saw that they were having an argument or something, and he gets attacked. Cadixton, there's one person in Cadixton, a black person, who's told that he cannot walk in a particular street. He's got to walk around. And when he was seen walking in that particular street, he was attacked. Unfortunately, if you read the newspaper clippings of what took place in Cadixton near Barry, was that he actually stabbed the person who had attacked him. And then you have the biggest race riots. It takes place in Cardiff, down in Butetown. Okay, the newspaper estimates 1,000 white men attacked the homes of 3 to 4 black families. But these black families that they attacked, these are black males married to white females, not black males married to black females. Okay? So here you see the race riots manifested. Okay? You see the same things take place in America. When American GIs go back after 1919, after the war, the First World War, to America, a similar thing happens. Why is it simultaneously there's wars, blacks are being attacked in Wales and in the Americas? It's because of the unemployment. Because what happened was a lot of black males that stayed behind took the jobs of those white men who now became soldiers. So when those soldiers returned back and they saw these black men with their women, with their jobs, this is where the concept comes from. You come over, you take our job, you take our women. It came during the First World War. This is where it came. And then after the 1940s, 50s, it becomes crystallized as a slogan in order to demean or to attack people who came from the Commonwealth. The only thing I want to mention here about the 1962 Commonwealth Act to reduce the amount of blacks from settling here, England, Wales, Scotland, even Ireland, is that when this was actually passed, this did not include Canada. Even though they say the Commonwealth, it doesn't include Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And why is that? Because they are the Commonwealth. So they are dealing with people's skin colour where this was concerned when this was actually passed. So you know about the amount of dark-skinned people that came over here to work in the war effort. Because after the Second World War, many of the people in this country did not want to do the jobs. They found the jobs demeaning, beneath them, etc. The empires increased, so there's a form of nostalgia and greatness, so they think that this is beneath them. So a lot of workers from the Caribbean, male as well as female, comes over here and to work. And the amount of pressures, hostilities that they had to endure was immense. Let me just look at some race relation acts. So the first major act which is passed is the Race Relation Act of 1965. Now what's disturbing about this is that when black history is taught in school, they talk about racial segregation in America. Black people had to go to their own fountains. They had to live in their own areas. Yeah? They had to get to the back of the bus. They had to use special cards on trains. A similar thing was happening here. When this was passed in 1965, black people could not go to restaurants, hotels, up until 1965. Restaurants, hotels, they couldn't go to seaside resorts, couldn't go on beaches, and the list just goes on and on. So even though they talk about racial segregation in America, exactly the same thing happens here. But there was no signs. That was the only difference. There was no signs. So the government had to pass this in order to try to change things, because even though black people could come over here to work, they couldn't live in houses. You know, certain people, proprietors to property, were told they couldn't sell these houses to black people. So they had to live in, you know, you have 20 men living in a small room. This was the reality right up until the 1960s. They didn't even pass housing acts. Black people could build houses, create houses, develop houses, but those same houses they couldn't live in. And even if you ask many of the, you know, even discrimination in this city with buses, there was a certain period that black people weren't allowed to get on buses. They could become bus drivers. You could be a driver but not a passenger. Okay? So this all changed after 1965. We know there was things in Manchester, there was things in Bristol, with black people protesting to use public transportation. And if you speak to most of those black women that worked in National Health Service, they said they had a similar problem too. When they were wearing their nurse's uniform, catching the bus, they were well respected, well received, and yeah, they were given gratitude. But as soon as they changed out of that into their normal clothes, then they saw the real hostility. And there's even, if you speak to some of the women, where they basically says that even though they were working in the National Health Service in this city, they couldn't use it. They couldn't use the service. They can give service, so they couldn't use the service. This is the reality of what the UK was like up until 1965, even though the institution had changed to a large extent to allow more upward mobility, or more integration rather, that, as far as integration was concerned, it improved for some people. It didn't improve in all communities. Okay, this is something I think we really need to emphasize. Then there was another 2 Race Relation Acts, which were passed. The Race Relation Act of 1968, which they're celebrating now, 50 years. This is for housing, for black people to live in decent housing. 50 years ago. But the government allowed them council property even, social housing. Okay, this is something for us to think about, 1968. Race Relation 1976 was to deal more with employment, the financial, economic disparities between black and white workers. A lot of black males which worked in the semi-skilled plants within this city, unions would go on strike for these. Unions would literally go on strike because a lot of these black men were working alongside their so-called white male counterparts. But they were getting paid less. They were deliberately getting paid less for doing the same job, right up until 1976. Okay? Whereby you couldn't discriminate, that employers could not discriminate on grounds of race, colour, etc., etc. Now, a year before this, they passed the Equal Pay Act. But the Equal Pay Act, which was passed a year before 1975, was passed exclusively for white females. Okay? That's what it was passed for. When black females were turned around in 1975 and said, well, that includes me, they said, you're a woman, but you're a black woman. The law doesn't extend to your kind. So what happened was the government came in a year later and had to put and attach to this particular act, equal pay. So if black males or females are doing the same as their white counterparts, they would be paid the same. Right, I think I've rushed through all these. Yes, I finished. Oh, I went through about 30 slides then. Right. Any questions, just open up for discussion. I can elaborate, clarify certain things, etc. And I hope I've been clear because my throat has been killing me. Any questions at all on any of the slides?
So when the soldiers returned from the war back to Wales, then we saw all of these racial segregation and racism emerging.
Good question. Well, put it this way. In the First World War, in 1919, there was an element of integration between the races, between the blacks and the whites. Obviously it was excluded to particular areas. But the reality was there was some sort of integration. But problems started in 1919 because a lot of the white men that came back as soldiers were disillusioned because many of the women were prostitutes, were now married to black men. This was one thing. And the other thing was, a lot of the jobs that they had were either in the hands of women, these women, or their husbands, who were black. And that was the main sentiment that took place in 1919. Okay? Because the riots could have happened a year before, but it happened as soon as these blacks returned back from war. But in the First World War, what was different in the Second World War was that troops could keep their revolvers. If you dispatch revolvers during the First World War, etc., you can keep them when you came back. They didn't make the same mistake during the Second World War for obvious reasons. Okay? And then when the Second World War was over, etc., Britain needed building. After German bombings, etc., they had a low labour force because a lot of men died within these two wars. Hundreds upon thousands, millions had died between these two wars, etc. So they needed a cheap labour force to come to rebuild their country. Because they were building at places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and other colonies. But they now had to rebuild the UK. And when they built the UK, there was restrictions. After 1948, when the Windrush came over, there were social restrictions put on black people when they came here, even though those restrictions weren't expressed or explained to them when they were in the Caribbean islands. So I hope I've answered your question.
What about the black people who are already here though? How did that affect them? They obviously owned houses, but then that racism said you can't own the house.
Well, at that time it was different because it was seamen, they were paying their taxes, etc., but they were confined to particular areas. So if you look at Wales, say for instance, you can live in Newtown, don't try and live in Grangetown, don't try and move to Canton, don't try to move to Riverside. So once you go over that bridge, that was like a no-no area. So this is why Cardiff Bay or the docks was able to develop and then have multicultural convivial element where people really got on together because they had to. They really had to. Because Newtown consisted of over 100 different racial and ethnic groups and over 60 languages were spoken in this one area. And they had to literally get on. They lived together, worked together, ate together, married from one another, etc. So everything was confined there. But to try to get upward mobility, to try to get property in another area at that time would have been a problem. And that was a similar thing in most of the major cities in England as well. You were confined to particular areas, so you would be able to purchase a house or rent property. Okay, but outside that area, it was basically a no-no. And that only came to light around about the late 1960s, when banks, would reluctantly give loans, because how we bought houses, or my family bought houses, where 200 people had to get together and put their money into a pot, 200-300 people sometimes. So each week, a member was putting a deposit on the house. This is how we had to do it. We call it partner. Okay, we pool your money together in order to buy something. This is the way we could do it, because even though we were citizens of this country, because of the Act which was passed in 1948, 49, Commonwealth Act, etc., banks wouldn't give us loans because they said, well, you're not a citizen, even though you were a citizen. And then we saw this year the ugly head of the Windrush, people who've come over here 50, 60 years, who are now being sent back. They pay their taxes, national insurance number, send their children to school, who are paying taxes as well, and this is the way they're being treated. So it's unfortunate that's what's happened. Okay? I hope I've answered. Anything else? Any other questions?
Have a break.
What's that?
Have a break.
Have a break. Go on. You must have more questions. Okay, let me ask you something. What about the first part of the presentation I mentioned about Africans preceding lighter-skinned people in this country? Was this news to any of you for the first time? Or do you know about this before? Or were you simply suppressing it?
Good question.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So I'm really fascinated by some of this information that's being suppressed, and is from what you're saying, still being suppressed. How is it being suppressed?
So what happens is, when findings occur, rather than simple put it through the mainstream academia, etc., they'll put it in the basements of museums, or the studies are carried out at certain universities and is not shared with the general public. It's just shared with a few people within that circle. And that is one of the reasons why a lot of this information is coming out now, because a lot of white people who have actually grown up with black, brown, red, yellow people are now going into these fields and they're bringing this to light. So they're being exposed by their own, saying, why this information out? That they, the original people, that the fossils that we found in, by Stonehenge, were African people. So who were the Druids now, who were supposed to have compiled that, etc.? So it puts question marks, and that is what's happened, unfortunately, in the colonial period. Things were misconstrued, things were, black contribution, achievement, accomplishment was written out of the history books. So what happened was, anthropology was relegated to the study of black people, and it came under the ban that either they were savage or primitive tribes or groups, because there was three classifications: primitive, savage, or civilized. So all black, brown, yellow, and reds were in the primitive, savage, barbaric, and whites were so-called civilized. This is how it was stratified, taxonomized at that particular period. Okay?
I think that most of this information that you showed about the African descendant, I think I myself as a North African, we're not much exposed to these information, because I think once we study the African history or what happened to African people all around the world, they only show us the negative things, like slavery, like all the negative things, but they fail to show us like there were amazing civilizations in Africa, like Ghana and Mali empires and things like this. I think this is the problem with everyone. We lack awareness about these kinds of positive things that African brought to the world, not only what happened and what they had to suffer and things like.
Well, this is why I was talking about that classification. You know, you've got the three methods of historical approach. The survivalist approach that Patterson talks about. The survivalist approach is about us resisting colonization, colonialism, racism. So it confines itself to the conflict theory as black and white, contentious. Okay? And then you have the other one, which was contributionism. This is something that most of us that were born in the 20th century want to look at. We want to look at the great empires, cultures, and civilizations of Africa. So if Egypt is in Africa, you know, why couldn't it be Africans that built the pyramids? But DNA is showing this, but they will suppress it. I can read skulls. I can tell from a skull the ethnicity or the racial composition of that skull. And what I noticed when I watched all these things on Discovery Channel, etc., by Egyptologists, as soon as they show a skeletal remains with a skull on, it's shown for milliseconds. Because it's clear who is who. So I think what has happened, because of colonization, colonialism, African people are now trying to reclaim their history. You know, okay, that's, you know, slavery colonization is a chapter, but that chapter has now become the whole history, as opposed to being a little segment in our historical experience over time. And I think because of colonization, different European groups went into places like Africa, so there was a colonial education that was given to the native or indigenous people of those countries. So when you talk about like North Africa, it was controlled by France. They had a colonial objective to preserve that specificity that blacks were savage, negative, didn't build civilization, etc., with the overlords, we are superior. It was that type of thing that was put in the educational curriculum in North Africa. Britain did the same thing in East Africa, the Italians did the same thing in their territories, the Portuguese. This is what the Berlin Conference was about when they decided to divide up Africa. Yeah? Once we divide it up first, then we send our troops there to take it over. Yeah, and then we've got to put an educational system in there in order to maintain, to control the minds of the people. Because to control the minds of the people, we control their labour, therefore we control their resources. And that was what was really believed and planned out by the European powers at the 1800s. Okay, so I hope I've answered your question. Any other questions at all? Yeah, go on, Ed.
Are the troops, since 1919, those black troops from the Afro-Caribbean that came to Britain?
The troops that came to Britain?
Yeah. Something on the slide about that.
Yeah, 1917? 1950, 1917.
So they fought in the First World War with the British Army, and did most of them go back, or they just couldn't make it?
Right, there was two groups. You had groups of people that were already here, married to local white females, whether it was in Cardiff, Liverpool, and all those places. So you had that group. So some of them signed in to become troops to fight in the war effort. Then what happened was the Crown decided that they wanted their colonies to participate within the thing. So this is when they offered to ask Africans from the Caribbean, who we call West Indians, which we now call African Caribbeans, to come over to help them to work in the war effort. And that's what happened. But the vast majority of those that were from the West Indian Regiment, from the Caribbean Islands, that went to the war effort, went back home. Some did come here.
Some did settle.
Some did come here, yeah.
It's
Because
just-
some were stationed here, had relationships, went to war, came back. You know, they married local women, etc. So the vast majority went back to the Caribbean Islands. Only a few would have settled here.
Do they ever have memorials for them? The black soldiers who fought for the British Empire who saved them from fascism?
There's one coming up, I think.
They're beginning to acknowledge this now. I don't know if there's memorials, but there's remembrances. There's events that are put on there's events that are put on to remember, you know, the colonies' participation in helping Britain through the First World War, Second World War. You know, even in the First World War, there was hundreds of thousands of Muslims, you know, from all over the world, not just from Arabia and from West Africa, etc., from Asia, that participated in the First and the Second World War. So it's for us to really tear those pages, you know, open up those pages and let the people know what really happened. You know, and I think this is what needs to be done as far as we are concerned in trying to enlighten people and make people acknowledge the truth behind history.
I think there's an event coming up maybe at the Temple of Peace in November to commemorate and remember the contribution of their communities to various wars, I think. So.
Yeah, we can keep that out. It's the 2nd of November, 6:30 p.m. at the Temple of Peace.
Yeah.
And that is a remembrance service for Wales's ethnic minority servicemen and women. So the 2nd of November.
Come on, guys, any more questions?
Am I allowed to have another question?
Yeah.
Yes, quick one.
Could I just ask you, what do you think about Black History Month being opened up to different BLE?
Different.
So a more diverse...
It is open to a more diverse group, it is.
Yeah,
But
it
I
is.
I wouldn't want the name to change because the name has an historical relevance. We're dealing with the broken people who've been denied their culture, religion, customs, norms, values, and all these other type of things, who's trying to find and steer themselves in the 20th and 21st century and trying to do for self. So, for me personally, I don't feel it should be infiltrated. I think if people want to come along to help develop it, yes, but we want, you know, our history's been in control of other people's hands. We want to take it back now. If you want to help us build, solve, put the jigsaw puzzle pieces together, etc., that is fine. So as far as, you know, because they're talking about having it, what do you call it, something week, something month, diversity, yeah, diversity month they want to call it. It's going to lose, it's going to lose the black historical essence. When it started off in the early 1930s, it was because when black was studied within the universities or spoken within the political arena, yeah, it was always through a negative lens or through a negative voice. And the whole point of it starting off was to look at those contributions, achievements and accomplishments and contributions by those people and bringing it to light. Because it doesn't get done any other time of the year. So it started off as Black History Week, or Negro History Week, and coloured history, because we've gone through these different gradations. You know, there was one time we were Moors, and we were Negroes, now we're coloured, now we're black, now we're urban now. The younger generation is talking about they're urban now, so we've become really fat. All these days, which is socially constructed, you know. Yeah, so I hope I answered your question, but I think it should stay the way it is, you know, because I think we are inviting people. If you look at Notting Hill Carnival, for instance, the reason why Notting Hill Carnival came about every year in August, and it was the largest street festival in the UK for 20 years. I'm not sure if it still is, actually. But it was a larger, and the reason why was because of the race riots that took place in 1957, 1958. And black people thought, well, look, you know, white people become hostile to us because we're here longer than we should have been, because the government never told the people that we were going to come. The government told the people they come here, work, and go back home. The government knew that wasn't going to happen. They knew that. Okay, so when they started to see children arriving, children going to school with their children, yeah, question marks started to appear. So there was a lot of tension within that community, and there was a riot that took place. And the reason why Notting Hill Carnival came, because black people thought, well look, they are decent people, they're ignorant at the end of the day. You know, they have invited us into their city, into their towns, into their communities, but there's a bit of hostility. So let's have like a party or something, let's give them something that we can share and invite them to. Okay? And that started off in 1958 and it still runs even now. Every year in August. It's not just in London now on Notting Hill, in Bristol, Manchester, there's carnival all over the place. So that was how it developed and the reason behind it. But even though it's called carnival, it's very diverse. Very diverse. People from all different ethnic groups and communities come to participate and collaborate in this celebration. And it was our way of saying, you know, please welcome us. We're not here to take or steal from you. We were invited here, yeah, and we want to, and our kids are born here, our kids are from here, and they're here to stay. That was the whole reasoning behind the Notting Hill Carnival, okay? And this is what I mean, you know, when things are organic, there's an emphasis, there's a reason behind its existence, okay? And to maintain it, sometimes things will change, yeah, but generally, you know, if people want ownership of something because those things still exist or persist within society, then that thing should be maintained until whatever they wanted to try to establish is totally eradicated or eliminated from society. Okay? Any other questions?
I've got one.
Go on then.
Okay, you talk a lot. I know you're really involved in education, obviously. Do you think the curriculum is changing in light of kind of all the stuff that you've brought up today? Do you think it's moving forward?
It is needed.
In its theory?
And I've got a bit of news that I'm actually doing some consultancy work with the Moorish Islamic government now, who's looking to, because there's a new national curriculum, a new national Welsh curriculum which is going to be out after 2020, and the Welsh government feels that it needs to be more diverse within the curriculum, because in Wales they're rediscovering their past along with us. So the Welsh and the African Caribbeans is really in the same boat, in a sense. And what the Welsh Assembly government wants to do, they want to try to embed Black and African historical studies within the Welsh curriculum, but not to destabilise the Welsh or the British contribution, but to make it fair and to make it more, appealing, I suppose, to the recipients, which is the pupils within school, so they don't grow up with those negative mentalities. And I think it's a good thing, because I was speaking to a woman a few months ago, 39, and I kept on mentioning colonization, colonialism, and I was saying this for a good couple hours, because we were speaking for a few good hours. And she turned to me, she says, I'm embarrassed to ask this, but what is colonization and colonialism? I'm from Cardiff, went to school, well educated. She says she's never heard this term before. If you're 38, you've never heard that term, then it actually shows what's not being done in trying to represent a particular group of people. Why is it being suppressed? I know histories can be shameful in some cases, but to build a child, if a child all it knows is negativity, because you have to understand it from our point of view. You know, we were enslaved for 5 centuries. It's a long time. Walking around with someone else's first name and second name, which is not African, they're mainly European names. The religious affiliations are usually from other groups of people. Our linguistic expression is a foreign language. So we've literally been stripped from everything. And then being told to integrate, but not in this particular thing. Integrate here, but you can't come this, yeah? So there is like stoppages in our integration and our mobility within society. So for us, and for the generation I come from, for me it's important because, I'll give you an example. I'm Maroon. my ancestry can be traced back to the first people that Columbus brought from Spain in 1492 to Jamaica. Okay? So I can trace back to them. I'm from the Maroon community. Okay? And as a result of that, you know, the Maroon groups of people, they've always tried to fight in order to, you know, to preserve themselves, preserve their identity, etc. It was difficult, but they were able to do it to some extent. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge and to recognise and to realise that, you know, as individuals, that we all have to contribute somewhat to the development of this story, you know, because Black history is Welsh history. It is Welsh history. Because that's what it should be called, just history. I don't even like the term Black history, even though I'm a historian who specialises in Black and African experiences. Even I do have a problem with Black history. It should be just called history. But when you're not involved in history, you've got to call it other than what it is, to emphasise the contribution and achievement that takes place. So that's the important thing about that reality. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for
And I do agree with Black History Month, by the way. I asked the question, but
yeah, it's okay, you don't have to say, you know, if it's not
Yeah, it's just blurry out.
Yeah.
That way, through the glass door.
Any other questions?
Fascinating stuff. I believe some people, or most of us, have to go back to work. Unfortunately, I can sit here all afternoon. You're more than welcome to stay here and continue the conversation. Or else we can continue the conversation through these, so please do fill them in, please do keep in touch with us. We would love to be doing a lot more work with you, especially as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
So, yes, please do take a look at some of the items from Cardiff Uni Library collections. Are we going to put a video on, a film?
Yeah, we've got something on, but if people want to keep talking.
Yeah, we're more than welcome to stay if you want to go. You can go if you want to stay.
If anybody wants to purchase this DVD, feel free to hit the back, okay? If anybody wants to purchase this
We
DVD.
sign it.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I've never done an autograph before. Yes.
Let's start it. And a big thank you to Abu-Bakr Madden, because I'm sure you'll agree that's absolutely fantastic.
Thank you very much. And my sincere apologies for my throat. You know, if you didn't hear me, I was a bit croaky, etc. It's because of my throat. Because I'm, you know, I think I got a flu coming on. So, but thanks anyway for turning up. I really appreciate it. Excellent turnout. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Thanks a lot.
Information.
Sorry?
You need to put it back.
Yeah, give me back. Yeah.
Hello. It's still on, yeah.
That's okay. Come.
That's fine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, have a good day. Yes. Let me just switch this off.